Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. Now, if you ever doubted that less really can be more, then look no further than the short Japanese poetry form known as the haiku. I think a lot of us can find poetry slightly intimidating, but it's almost impossible not to be seduced by these small verses that can so cleverly capture a moment and turn it into something with great meaning. And to discuss the haiku with me, it's both a pleasure and an honor to be joined by, amongst other things, the editor of the Penguin Book of Haiku. He is Professor Adam L. Kern. Professor Kern, welcome to In Conversation.
Hi, Alastair. Thank you so much for having me. And I hope that you're well in these crazy times.
I'm well. In the UK, we're basking in some rather unusual sunshine right now. So I'm very well. Thank you. Professor, or you told me earlier I could call you Adam, if that's okay.
Please.
Kind of part of me wants to call you Professor, but yeah, I will go with Adam. I thought we could start with my asking you some parameters, maybe a definition of what constitutes a haiku, and what does the word haiku actually mean?
Well, there's a lot of debate around this question, Alastair, and to simplify, because after all, that's what haiku are about, in many ways, simplification. In most traditionalist accounts, that is, in most accounts that people think of as qualifying as haiku, it's a form of Japanese micropoetry in 17 syllables that are often broken up into 3 phrases of 5, then 7, then 5 syllables. Often containing a seasonal allusion and some kind of cut that ruptures the poem into 2 halves in order to allow the reader or the listener to step in and make sense of some central mystery in a very engaging fashion. So I think that that's what most people think of as haiku. Historically, however, haiku were incredibly different than that. The term haikai no ku, which ultimately gave rise to the term haiku, which is an abbreviation of haikai no ku, means a kind of lightly linked sequential series of verses. And within that linked poetry, there were many, many different modes and feelings and kinds of haiku. Some of which were only 14 syllables, although these get regularly overlooked by traditionalist definitions of haiku. Others of which were bawdy or satirical or irreverent or didn't have any seasonal association at all. So for most people, haiku is this very prescribed Japanese traditional micropoetry, but historically it was much broader, wilder, and exciting than that, I should say.
So we're talking about the 17 syllables. We're talking about 17 Japanese syllables, I imagine, I suppose, yeah, in the 5-7-5 structure. And would it be fair to describe haikus as light verse? Would that work? Do you think?
So for traditionalist haiku, a lot has been made out of the kind of Zen mindset that a lot of the poets supposedly had and a lot of the readers maintain today. But in point of fact, that's not really what haiku was about historically. This kind of playfulness or punning, irreverence was really much closer to the spirit of haiku historically, which is not to say, Alastair, that Zen can't be playful. A lot of Zen thinking is actually quite playful.
That's good to hear. Well, tell us, because the word kurumi comes up a lot in association with writing haikus. And just explain to the viewers what kurumi is and how it fits into the haiku pattern.
Right. So karumi in Japanese refers to something that's light, something that has a light touch, or something that is very gentle. And there are all of these associated terms that are thrown about, bandied about in the writings of haiku in various languages. For example, muga and hosomi. Muga means egolessness, and hosomi means thinness. And the idea here is to enter into your poetic subject while suspending your ego, just to sort of touch on it very gently. The way that I think about this is a gymnast who has prepared years and years and years for a particular move, and she or he pulls it off effortlessly. Looks just absolutely stunning, like they just tossed this off the cuff in a way that belies all of the training. So karami is like that. It's a kind of light touch in poetry that makes one think that the poet just sort of threw it off on the spur of the moment, when in point of fact, traditionally in Japan, it took years and years and years, if not decades, to learn all of the technical rules and aesthetics behind this kind of poetry in multiple circumstances, right? Because there are many different modes to be able to pull it off effortlessly.
And is karumi, or if I'm pronouncing it, karumi, is that something that's achieved by long hours of meditation, or is that maybe it's not necessary?
Yeah, I would say not. I would say that the association of haiku with Zen and or Buddhism is overrated. And I know that a lot of people would disagree with me about that. There is Zen haiku, and studying Zen and studying Buddhism allows one to enter into this mode of composition easily, at least some people. But you don't need to be a Zen monk or nun to write haiku. In fact, Bashō very famously, when he was discoursing about how to write, he said, you know, really what you need to do is suspend your ego. Don't put yourself into the poem. If you want to write about pine trees, learn about the pine from the pine. If you want to write about bamboo, learn about bamboo from bamboo. In other words, don't let your mishigas or your craziness enter into the representation of the poetic subject. Just enter into the subject without your ego and present it clearly.
Oh, that's lovely to hear. That strangely just resonates, I thought, with a poet I particularly like, Rilke, who I think he once said, if the wine is bitter, become the wine. In other words, just take away that separation between yourself and what you're trying, or what is ever creating a response within you. It's very pure in a way. It's beautiful. You mentioned earlier on, Adam, the cutting word. Can you say a little bit more about that and how, or the function that it performs within the haiku structure?
Sure. So within the individual standalone 17 syllables of a haiku, the poet does not have very much room to explain things or to elaborate on the finer nuances and details. So the language needs to be very clean and simple. And over time in Japan, haiku poets or poets in general found that there were several different ways of overcoming this brevity. One was by alluding to the seasons in a way that would conjure up all of these associations that were more or less ready-made. So if I were to say Halloween, in the States at any rate, people think of kids coming around begging for candy and these annoying candy corns that are tricolor that taste like wax, and sort of, you know, all of these things come to mind. Mm-hmm. And the season word has been made much of in traditionalist accounts of haiku, although surprisingly, the season word was only insisted upon in the early 20th century, so it's not traditional. The cut, however, goes way back in Japanese history as a way of composing a verse into two structures that someone would have to step in and solve to see how these parts were related. So to quote a poem, not by Rilke, but by Robert Speece, who was an American haikuist who lived here in Madison, Wisconsin, where I live. and was one of the editors of the Modern Haiku Poetry magazine. He wrote, "Snowing, the dentist polishes my teeth." Now, that break in the poem between the word snowing and the dentist polishes my teeth is this gaping chasm, right? It's a kind of pause in the rhythm, pardon me, but it's also a break in the meaning of the two parts of the poem. Snowing, ... the dentist polishes my teeth. So when you hear this or when you read this, how are you going to make sense of this as a verse? What is the relationship? And for some people, having cold water thrown into the mouth reminds them of snow. And so it's the sensation of cold that joins these two halves. For other people, it's the idea of whiteness of snow and the white teeth that they're hoping to achieve by going to the dentist. For other people, it's that ... snowing, ellipsis, the dentist polishes my teeth, because sometimes when fluoride is put on one's teeth, at least in the States, there's a kind of grittiness to it. So for different people, they might have their own particular reaction to solving this mystery of the cut within this verse. So this is, again, Alastair, within this kind of traditionalist haiku. Historically, the cut functioned between verses so that you would write a verse, say, roses are red, violets are blue. And then I would come in with a rejoinder, my feet are stinky and so are you. and that cut was actually allowing for another poet to join the conversation. And that's what haikai-no-ku, or what haiku traditionally was all about, was a group composition where people were responding to each other on the spur of the moment, in point of fact, playfully. Although, of course, they had years and years of practice, and there were many arcane rules governing their responses.
Adam, how did this begin for you? What first tweaked your interest in haiku? Or to put it another way, do you remember your first haiku?
I, in fact, do not remember my first haiku, although I'm pretty sure that it would have been in the 4th grade in the States, where haiku has been taught for a very long time, mostly to make sure that fourth graders were able to count to 17 without taking their shoes off. So I do not remember, but I was an exchange student in Japan when I was 16 and 17, and became very interested in Japanese culture, Japanese language, Japanese comics. And when I came back to the States and attended college, I remember reading some books that had haiku in them, mostly on my own, but some of them were associated with college courses. And I just remember loving them so much my first year that rather than going to medical school, I kept fantasizing about being outside under a tree reading Japanese poetry. And that's more or less where I've ended up, although today, unfortunately, I'm inside.
Yeah, but tell us a little bit about that time in Japan, because that's a hell of a commitment to I mean, learning Japanese, particularly writing Japanese. I mean, I would be pretty scared of the prospect of doing that. How was your time in? What were you doing? Were you attached to a Japanese university, or were you working there? How did you pass your time?
So I grew up in a small town in the Midwest in the United States on the prairie, and there was not very much else going on. So I wanted to go someplace interesting like Paris. Paris was booked in the Rotary Club exchange program. And they said, if you want to go to France, we can send you to a small village. But if you want to go to a big city, what about going to Tokyo? Because nobody knows Japanese back then. Nobody wants to go to Japan. And I thought, Tokyo, yes, that might be very interesting. So I ended up going and staying for what turned out to be 2 Japanese school years, because after 1 year, I loved it so much and realized that I knew next to nothing. and just returning stateside would be, I think, a little bit futile. So I decided to stay on longer. So after that, I went back to Japan repeatedly throughout college and graduate school, and I think I've spent about a total of 12 years living and working in Japan in various capacities.
Adam, a couple of years ago, I spent a week in Tokyo on my own with nothing to do. I was in Tokyo for a week with nothing to do. And I've got to say, I thought it was the most fascinating city I've been to. And I've been to a lot of cities. I just loved Tokyo. And it was also the city I think I felt the most foreign in, or I really felt that huge gap between the culture I came from and the culture I was in during that week. I think it's also the week I had some of the best food in my life too. It's a hell of a city, Tokyo, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, talking about food, the Michelin guide to restaurants worldwide gives more space to Tokyo than to New York and Paris combined. Wow. So it's an astounding city in terms of culinary delights. I spent a lot of time in Tokyo, but I also spent a lot of time outside of Tokyo as well, spending 2 years in graduate school at the University of Kyoto, for example, and trying to go on homestays across Japan. So I spent time working on a tobacco farm, picking tobacco, not something that I'm morally supportive of, but it was a great experience. I spent time in a small fishing village in the northernmost island of Japan, fishing for crab and sweet shrimp early in the morning. So I tried to get out and see as much of Japan as I could. And those places are much different than Tokyo. Tokyo is very much like London or New York in many respects, but go out to the countryside and it's almost as though you're going back in time in some cases.
Yeah. What was your reaction, Adam, the day Penguin dialed your number and asked you to produce an anthology of haiku? It was a good day for you, I guess.
Yeah, it was wonderful. I got an email, so I didn't actually receive a telephone call. And I wrote back within 30 minutes saying I would be happy to do it on a couple of conditions. One is that I not be confined to writing about only traditionalist haiku. Haiku is a broad category that covers many, many different kinds of verses. And I must be allowed to include comic haiku, dirty, sexy haiku. And as a consequence of the latter, I also need to be able to use naughty words in the Penguin anthology. Of course, Penguin had done Lady Chatterley's Lover and gone through the entire obscenity thing. So I knew that I was barking up the right tree in that case. And in fact, the editors at Penguin were wonderfully supportive in allowing me to use colorful language, especially in the dirty, sexy haiku.
Well, it's true. I mean, reading through the haiku, the anthology, I mean, there's some of them. I mean, some of them aren't even suitable for Viking.TV, I would suggest. They're pretty raw, some of them, and also some of them are very funny, which is, I think, a thing that people don't often associate with haiku. As you said earlier, it's not just about the Zen Buddhist aspect. I get the feeling they had a lot of fun, these guys, sitting around drinking sake and throwing out 3-line poems to each other.
Yeah, these guys and these women, because women were also actually incredibly involved in the production and consumption of haiku. In fact, I'll just give you one example, Alastair, that might be surprising. The woodblock artist Hokusai, whose Great Wave, I think everybody knows the Great Wave. It's not really called that, but it's known as the Great Wave. That's iconic of Japan in many respects. His third daughter, Oe, who actually assisted Hokusai in his artistic studio when he was older and losing his eyesight, she wrote haiku with her father and produced some very fine verses that are almost completely unknown in the West. She also was quite impish and had a taste for writing dirty, sexy haiku. And she wrote some absolutely fabulous and, alas, probably not repeatable verses, even on Viking.TV. But she was one example of a female haikuist whose work really should be, I think, studied and translated and made more widely available in English.
Well, there's your next book, Adam. That's a great plug, by the way. I know you beat me to it because I was going to ask you about whether women had any role in the creation of haiku, but you've answered the question. Thank you. But I think in the West, the one haiku poet that most of us may be familiar with is probably that of Matsuo Kinsaku, more commonly known simply as Bashō, who lived from 1664 until 1694. And before we look more closely at his life and work, could you just say something about the kind of Japanese 17th century society that Bashō would have grown up in?
Sure. So Bashō was born in Western Japan and eventually ended up gravitating to Edo, which is now Tokyo. And that alone tells us a lot about what was happening in 17th century Japan. Prior to that, the cultural capital of Japan had been Kyoto and the environment around Kyoto. But in around the year 1600, the Tokugawa shogunate established this new administrative capital in essentially this remote hinterland called Edo on swampland. And the cultural sort of momentum of the country was moving eastward from Kyoto and Osaka and Nara, actually, which is where Bashō was originally from, the area around Nara in Iga, traditionally. And everyone was moving to Edo, to this new administrative capital that, as I mentioned earlier, would become Tokyo. So there was this cutting of tradition, this moving away from the old imperial order that had been in and around Kyoto for 1,000 years in this new, almost frontier, Western, exciting town of Edo, where anything was possible. And so Bashō was actually a member of an old samurai family that had fallen into decline. And in fact, it's not very much is known because the records aren't very sharp, but his father probably had gone from being a very low-level samurai into being a land-owning sort of peasant in order to make ends meet. So the old order was crumbling, and Bashō decided that he was going to reinvent himself as a poet. So he moved to Edo. He became involved in poetry competitions, and he became involved in linked poetry. He floated around different poetic schools because although today Bashō is presented as the one and only master of haiku, in his day there were in fact many other schools. And around the year 1680, he had started his own school and had 10 or 20 disciples who would pay him to comment on their poetry. And one of his disciples gave him a Bashō tree, which is kind of a traveler's palm. And so he took that term, Bashō, and reinvented himself as the poet Bashō. And from that point on, his style progressed. It matured around 1685, and he made frequent trips around the country, which he wrote about in numerous poetic travelogues that were interspersed with his poetry. But scholarship has demonstrated that those trips around the country were more or less for Bashō to be visiting his disciples to get paid. And he would have these collaborative experiences with them where they would sit around, drink sake, write poetry, and then he would pluck out one or two interesting verses and put it in his travelogues. So if you mention Bashō, the poem that everybody knows is the one about the old pond and the frog plunging in, the sound of water. And that poem is almost always presented as a standalone modernist kind of haiku. You know, it's all about the Zen contrast between the immediacy of a frog plunging in and the sort of eternal pond. But in point of fact, this was merely the opening foray in one of these collaborative sessions. So not very many people know the response to this poem. His disciple Kikaku wrote, and I'm going to look in my notes here if I can see it.
Sure.
In Japanese, he wrote, Ashi mo wakaba ni kakaru kumo no su. The translation is, on young leaves of rush hangs a spider's web. So that was the repost or the retort to Bashō's poem, which in my translation runs, old pond, a frog plunges into water sound.
Okay.
So this is a conversation. Roses are red, violets are blue, my feet are stinky, so are you.
You see, I think this is really interesting because I think you're giving, well, you're certainly readjusting my whole perception, and a lot of us, I think, the idea that haikus are standalone poems, whereas they're not. They're linking, they're verses that are linked, and it's a group activity, basically, isn't it? It seems to me. The one you referred to, which I call the frog leaping haiku, I mean, could I ask you first, Adam, to just read it in Japanese, and then, or say it in Japanese, so we get the feel for it, and then read it again in English, and then we'll talk about why it's so important.
Yeah. So the verse goes, Furuike ya kawazu tobikomu mizu no oto, and it's a very unusual verse in Japanese. Furuike literally means old pond, but usually in Japanese, the word for old is furui. And this is furuike. So it's, if I could represent it in English, it would be old pond as one word. But furuike can also be interpreted as an old feeling. So there's a little bit of wordplay in this. Kawazu is an old term for frog. Tobikomu means to sort of plunge into something. But the form of tobikomu is an adnominal form, which means that it modifies what comes after it. And so in many translations, there is the sense that you can actually pause the poem or stop the poem there. And that in the Japanese, it's not true. It modifies what comes after it. And the mizu no oto, which mizu means water, no is a possessive, and oto means sound, can also be read in another way. Mizu also means unseen, not to see. So mizu no oto can be watery sound or water sound if we wanted to put it into just one truncated form. Water sound that is not seen. So there are many different levels and polyvalences to this verse that open the door for other poets to playfully respond. Of course, now it's represented as this, Zen masterpiece, but in his own day, I don't think that many people would have interpreted it that way. In fact, Alastair, for nearly 1,000 years, frogs were famous in Japan. Their quintessence was croaking, and so very poignantly, Bashō's frog doesn't croak, he just plops into the water, right? He makes this sort of watery sound. So there's this sense that you are slipping on a banana peel, on an unexpected banana peel, because instead of the usual croaking of the frog, you get this plopping. So it's humorous, it's light, it's fun.
Oh, that's amazing. I mean, isn't it just wonderful the way 3 lines, 17 syllables, you just deliver all that? I mean, that's a lot of bang for the buck on that one. That's just brilliant. I mean, through the magic of Google, I entered frog leaping haiku and came across no less than, well, I think more than 30 different translations of that of that particular haiku. And which brings me on to my next question, was about the whole business of translating, and how difficult is it to stay faithful to the original Japanese concept of what was the haiku was intended to convey, and how much is lost in how much. I mean, I remember once I showed I spoke a haiku to a Japanese friend of mine, and who spoke good but not that good English, and he just laughed, because he knew the haiku in Japanese, and to him it sounded very clunky. And so how much do we lose in translation, do you think?
A lot. It's extremely difficult to translate well. And if I were to be honest, I would say that my translations represent only the translations that I was actually least embarrassed about putting into a book. I think I translated something like 10,000 verses for this book. And of those 10,000, I put in about 1,000, just because they were the least insufferable. So it's extremely difficult. Japanese is a very different language than English. And if the idea was, as I'm claiming, for these verses to be polyvalent and open and playful, then they're written in a kind of language that resists translation, because there are very often multiple meanings to all of the words when put in combination. So you could have, I think 30 translations of this frog poem is actually nothing. So Hiroaki Sato has a book called, I think it's called 100 Frogs, where he has almost 100, maybe over 100 translations of that frog verse by Bashō.
That's incredible.
So, yeah. And all of them are fine and wonderful.
Right. So, but if we've established that haikus aren't just about frogs and watching the moon, can you give us, because I think they can be, and I've looked from the anthology, we get the idea that some of them are incredibly funny. I thought some of them were hilarious. Can you give us an example of one that you think has some humor in it?
Okay, sure. There's a bunch of them that I could cite. Maybe I can just give two, if I may be permitted.
Please. Please.
目についた女房この頃花につき. That's the Japanese. My English translation is, his wife, who once had caught his eye, now gets up his nose.
That's beautiful.
So this is a comic haiku, or a so-called senyu, excuse me, where the humor is really being sort of paraded out. And there's obviously some wordplay here on eye and nose. So that's kind of light fare, and that's fun. And I think it would have been worth a good chuckle when people are sitting around drinking sake, composing these things to one another. Another verse that I really like sounds funny, but it sort of conceals some very bitter socio-political satire. Goes like this. Yakunin no ko wa nigi nigi o yoku oboe. And the translation is, the bureaucrat's tot learns about grabby an awful lot. And this is a masterpiece of subtle wordplay. So the idea is that the bureaucrat's tot learns about grabby. And the word nigi in Japanese, which I render as grabby, is a childish word. But it's a word that maybe parents sometimes use with respect to a child grabbing a toy or grabbing hold of their hand. But in this case, we're seeing the corrupt world of bureaucrats who are taking bribes and grabbing onto things through the eyes of a child. And the term yoku in yoku oboe, the last phrase, literally means well or often. So on the surface, the idea is that the child learns well about grabbing things from his corrupt father, bureaucrat. But on a more subtle level, yoku can also mean next, as in the succeeding generation. So the idea here is that the corruption of Japan, the nepotism of this system, really is perpetuated on a kind of generational level by children learning how to be corrupt officials in the samurai class. So it's a very sardonic verse, and I think that that's an example of how senryu or comic haiku can actually be extremely poignant or satirical.
I just think they're just so clever. It's fantastic. Let's come forward to today, and I'd be very interested to know, Adam, where in today's modern Japan, where does the haiku sit? I mean, do children learn them at school? Would the name Bashō be known to everyone, just as we know the names of Byron or Keats or Robert Frost? A haiku contest still existing, or how popular?
Yes, so of course, Japanese have inherited the haiku. It was really turned into the national poetry in the late 19th, early 20th century. So the idea of Japaneseness is very much wrapped up in things like haiku, as well as contemporary comic books and animated movies. So children in Japan, like children in the United States, learn about haiku at a very young age, although in the United States there isn't this overlay of Japaneseness. But everybody in Japan knows about haiku. Everybody has probably composed haiku. In fact, by some estimates, the Japanese have the most poets of any country in the world, because so many people in Japan write haiku. If you open up any major newspaper today, you can find there are haiku columns. And there are also comic haiku columns known as Sarariman Senryu, or Salaryman Comic Haiku. And it's an interesting phenomenon, Alastair, because lately editorial cartoons have really dropped off sharply in Japan. There are very few newspapers, if any, that carry regular editorial cartoons. But all of the major newspapers carry these socio-political haiku that can criticize, say, the mishandling of the Olympics, or the mishandling of the COVID crisis in Japan, or the devastation of Fukushima, especially the government's response. So these are haiku, these comic haiku, these socio-political haiku have become a major vehicle for the average Japanese person to write in with criticism about Japan, about the government.
Well, you mentioned the Olympics. I mean, if they do go ahead, I assume there'll be some kind of an opening ceremony, and it'd be very interesting to see whether the haiku plays a part, or whether they do integrate the haiku somehow into an opening ceremony of the Olympic Games. I don't know, something to think about. Whilst researching for this conversation, Adam, I came across a walking tour that one can do in Japan, which follows the paths that Bashō took on his wanderings. And it sounds a wonderful thing to do. On this tour, your luggage is actually transported for you from beautiful hostel to beautiful hostel, where you can spend the evening drinking sake and taking hot baths and eating wonderful food. So all of the pleasure and none of the pain. Did you ever wander any of Bashō's pathways?
Well, I've never actually gone on this particular tour, and this is the Oku no Hosomichi tour, or the narrow road to the interior, oku being another pun, meaning the sort of northern recesses of Japan that are depicted here on your map, but also oku can refer to sort of the psychological interior of a person. So I've never actually, I've been to many of those places, although I haven't really followed around on Bashō's pilgrimage per se. But it is true that you can go to places really around Japan and see places where Bashō lived or where his disciples lived. And it's a big industry. I mean, the last time I was in London, my two children wanted to go on a Beatles tour. So we went to all of these places in London, Paul McCartney's house, and where the Beatles played their last rooftop concert before getting shut down by the police, et cetera, and so forth. My kids loved it. And I think that that's the kind of thing that fans of Bashō in particular really enjoy. I like some of Bashō's poetry, although I have to confess he's not my favorite. He's not my favorite poet. And I think that it's because he's so credited with having single-handedly invented the haiku and turned it into the modern standalone haiku, when in point of fact, that's not true. So he died, Alastair, as you mentioned, in 1694. The term haiku was really coined 2 centuries later in 1894 by a modern reformer, Masaoka Shiki, who's also a very famous haikuist. Strictly speaking, Bashō never actually wrote haiku, at least not in the modern sense of a standalone poem. He was always in this collaborative milieu, riffing off of other poets. So because of that distortion, I've tended to be much more interested in other poets. In fact, there was another poet by the name of Onitsura who probably elevated haiku to a serious art form at the same time, if not earlier, than Bashō did. And there's a saying in Japanese that in the East it's Bashō, in the West it's Onitsura. And Onitsura is one of the greatest haiku poets whom you or probably most other of our listeners have never heard of. So I think other people worked on loosening the lid to the cookie jar, and Bashō just came around and opened it up, and voila, here are these, tasty morsels called haiku. Aren't I great? But a lot of other people put a lot of hard work and effort into loosening that cookie jar lid.
Right. And can I ask you some questions being sent in by people who are watching us right now?
Absolutely.
If that's okay with you. What have we got? Poonam in Houston. Hi, Poonam. Says this is not a question. It's just a rather lovely comment. She says, "What a delightful show. I was not sure if the presenter would be so knowledgeable. I wish I can listen to him for a long time." There you go, Adam. You got a fan.
Well, I have to say, Alastair, that's very kind, Poonam. You're more than welcome to come to the University of Wisconsin and sit in on any of my lectures. But I have to say, I'm not really an expert on haiku. I know that I've been billed that way. I'm just someone who's read about haiku and thought about it for a long time. But that doesn't make me an expert.
No, you're right. I should have. It wasn't fair of me not to point that out at the beginning, because there's a lot more to you, Adam, than just haiku. You're very interested in manga, for example, and I think other forms of Japanese art, not just haiku. Yeah. Okay, what have we got? Yeah.
So I'm also a professor, Alastair, which means that I profess to knowledge while not actually knowing anything. So I prefer to try to remain humble here.
Patricia in Salt Lake City says, "Could you give us an example of a satirical haiku about the Olympics?"
Right.
Fingertips,
Actually, I don't think I can off the top of my head. So no, I don't think I can do that off the top of my head. I'm sorry, Patricia. Give me a little bit of time. I think, Alastair, you might be posting some reader haiku. And so, Patricia, on that board where Alastair is posting something, I promise you I will post an Olympics-related haiku.
That'd be great. Thank you. Another question from the same Patricia. She said, "Could you please spell the name of the other artist that you mentioned? The
Onitsura?
Yes. Can you spell it? So can you just spell it out so we can write it down?
Yes, absolutely. Oni is O-N-I, and Tsura is T-S-U-R-A. It's all one word, Onitsura.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for doing that. Kerry. Hi, Kerry in San Francisco. I understand that haikus don't rhyme, but should they intentionally be written not to rhyme? And if they do, is it not a haiku? Good question, Kerry.
So thank you very much for that question, Kerry. This is one of the misconceptions about haiku. When haiku was first translated from Japanese into English, because the translators assumed that haiku was poetry the way that Western poems are poetry back then, which rhymed, haiku were forced to rhyme. So there came in the probably 1940s and 1950s to be this sort of countervailing tendency where people were told that haiku must not rhyme. And so that's been sort of definitive of haiku. I'm sure that there are some dictionaries that say that haiku is an unrhymed poetry. I can tell you categorically, however, that that is not true. Haiku rhyme. They don't necessarily have end rhyme built into them the way that we had end rhyme built into Western poetry at a certain point in time. But because there are only 5 vowel sounds in Japanese, and there are 17 syllables in haiku, you're going to have some necessary repetition of the same word ending. So if you read any haiku in Japanese, you're going to hear some internal rhyme, some assonance, and poets were aware of this and play with it all the time. So my answer is actually, contrary to popular opinion, haiku in the original Japanese do in fact have a variety of forms of poetic rhyme.
Okay, that's a good answer. Thank you. Question now from D in Canada. D is a good friend of Viking, and D says a question for both Alastair and you, Adam. Alastair, you're a photographer, and to me, a photograph can be a light map, and instead of 1,000 words, some could be summed up in 17 syllables, just as a haiku could be translated to a photograph. Do you or Adam know of anyone who has bridged those ideas in a book? Well, that must exist. It's such a, it's such an obvious idea. You'd want to take haikus and take images and somehow let them work together, or let one be inspired by the other. Have you come across that?
So, D from Canada, thank you very much for that question. The answer is, of course, there are many books that conjoin sort of the verbal art of haiku with photography. This draws on a very long tradition in Japan of combining haiku poetry and I want to call it inkwash paintings. They're not really paintings per se, they're ink washes. So you use a brush and ink and you draw something. And usually the relationship between the words in the image has some kind of disjunction, just the way that the cut has or forms a disjunction within an individual haiku poem. So the answer is yes, there are a number of journals today that regularly put up this kind of playfulness between words and photography or computer-generated images. The general term for this kind of combination of words and images within haiku is called haiga, H-A-I-G-A. And the hai comes from haiku, and ga is the Japanese word for images, for pictures. So D, all you have to do is Google in the word haiga and photography, and you will come upon multiple entries for things that you can look into.
Perfect answer. Thank you. I got a good one here coming from, let me just find it again. Everything just shifted a little bit around on my questions. Yep, Sylvia. Hi, Sylvia in Vancouver. Here's a simple question. Please give us an example of the sexy haiku.
Okay, well, I can give you 2. I can give you one that's fairly innocuous but profound, and another one that's pretty raunchy, but hopefully not going to offend any of our Viking listeners. The first one is the piece of ass slapped by mistake. Excuse me, let me start over. The piece of ass slapped by mistake sends love letters. The piece of ass slapped by mistake sends love letters. So this is a wonderful verse because you can imagine a crowded marketplace and a woman is walking in her kimono and a guy comes up and pats her behind. She turns around and maybe it's somebody whom he hadn't expected. But it turns out that she's attracted to him. And even though he's surprised, she starts pursuing him in a kind of love relationship. So this is a wonderful verse because it accords women their own sexual agency beyond the stereotype of, the sort of male chauvinist pig in traditional Japan. Another verse that's a little bit raunchier goes like this: plying fingers as though he were at hand, the widow's orgasm.
Excellent.
So, like I said, this is a little bit raunchier. It's an interesting verse on the surface of it because obviously it affords a widow sort of continuing sexual fantasies, thinking about her long lost husband. But the interesting thing about this verse is that it's almost a verbatim burlesquing of a famous passage in the Confucian Analects. So there's a Confucius in which there's a passage in which Confucius reportedly says that to worship our ancestors, you have to do it so wholeheartedly that they appear at hand. And so this is sort of a slight burlesquing of that in very playful language. And it also gives you an idea of the kind of dirty, sexy verse that was widely practiced. Now, I just want to add, Alastair, that this dirty, sexy verse is something that I included in the book in order to demonstrate the breadth of the haiku phenomenon. I'm not making the argument that all haiku were obscene. In fact, quite the contrary. There are amazingly beautiful, poignant, aesthetic verses that fall under the rubric of haiku. But it would be a mistake to think that all haiku are Zen meditations on frogs and moons and cherry blossoms.
Well, no, that's the big takeaway I got from your anthology was because I didn't know that, and I think a lot of us didn't know that. So it's really great that you can illustrate that. Thank you. This is not a question, but a comment. Well, I'll read it out. Joan, hi Joan in Louisville, says, no question, just interested in writing haikus, which I've been doing for years. Bad and silly haikus, some nice ones. I cover all kinds of subjects, not just weather, but politics, gratitude, voting plans, hairdos, pets, and clothing styles. So haikus can really be about anything. Would that be correct?
Yeah, that's true. I think that historically that is absolutely on the mark. And then there was this period of time in the development of haiku abroad where it was really in the clutches of school marms who said that you have to have 17 syllables. And many of Bashō's poems don't. So the 17-syllable rule is very much like a traffic law in London, more of a suggestion than an actual hard and fast rule. And the same thing with the seasons and the same thing with everything else. Fortunately, since the 60s and 70s in the West, haiku has opened up again to be about almost anything. In fact, a lot of the modern haiku doesn't have 17 syllables. Maybe there's a short line, a long line, and a short line. So I think that actually anything that you want to be a haiku can, in certain circumstances, be considered a haiku. There's even a very famous one-word haiku that was printed on a blank page, and the word was tundra.
Wow.
So if you think about it,
yeah,
just on a blank white page, the word tundra, right? And this is a one-line haiku that is sort of taking account of its surroundings. So you could say that it's a haiga, a haiku picture, in a sense.
Oh God, isn't that clever? That's brilliant. Yeah. Jerry in Kent. Jerry says, as a former English teacher and sometimes poet, I love hearing from this expert at my alma mater. Can you speak to the evolution of poetry from rhyme schemes? Was this in haiku as well? I think we could have a whole episode probably just on that subject, don't you, Adam?
Yeah, I think so. One of the ways that I think about haiku in Japanese actually is as a kind of sound poetry. I think that once you become aware of the sounds in haiku, that it's much more interesting than merely reducing it to this notion of haiku as an image, which is the prevailing idea in traditionalist versions of haiku. So that notion of haiku as an image developed at a time in Japan's history when the Japanese were trying to modernize and westernize. And so the notion of photographic realism was taking hold in the late 19th, early 20th century. And so as a result, this idea of haiku as image became the main reading of haiku. But in point of fact, the sounds of haiku are far more interesting, in my humble opinion. And if you pay attention to them, I think it allows the translator all sorts of license to try to convey something of the auditory effect in English. So there's a whole history that we could talk about, Alastair, as you suggest, in 17 or 18 more episodes, which we obviously don't have the time for. But I think, simply put, overcoming the notion that haiku needed to be end-rhymed and becoming more attuned to the internal cadences, rhymes, rhythms, assonances of haiku has been really where people in the West have been sort of moving toward over the past couple of decades.
Wonderful. Professor Adam, we're coming to the end of our time. Sadly, I feel like I could go on with talking all evening with you about haikus, but we need to let you go. I'm going to invite viewers watching now to get creative and send in some of their own haikus. And I'd like, are there any tips or advice you could give to help them?
Well, since I'm not actually a haiku poet myself, I'm afraid not. There's really nothing that I could say. And in fact, probably many readers are much more qualified to answer this question. Many of your listeners, Alastair, and many readers in general are much more qualified to answer this than I am. But since I've read a lot of haiku, what works for me is keeping things simple, being not trying to sound like you're using poetic language, but using ordinary language in your own voice, and just trying to grasp some moment that resonates with you and to express that in as few words poem as possible, without elaborating or without going on and on like I am right now.
Beautifully done. Okay. You know, I thought it might be appropriate that we end our conversation with Bashō's final haiku, which is a personal favorite of mine. He composed it whilst lying on his deathbed in Osaka in 1694, and it goes like this. I won't read the Japanese, I don't know, but in English it goes like this. Sick on a journey, over parched fields, dreams wander on. And that, I think, is not only a beautiful haiku, but a beautiful way to end our conversation together this evening, Adam. Thank you so much. It's been really inspiring, and I loved the anthology. I feel we could talk a whole lot longer, but I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure that people watching have too. So thank you so much, and I wish you well.
Cheers, Alastair. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. All the best.
Take care.
So if you have caught the haiku bug and feel inspired to have a go, well, we'd love to see them. And we can share them on our social media, perhaps create a page on Viking.TV, on the TV site. You can email them to vikingfamily@viking.com. I think we can pop up the address just below me. There we are. And we'd be very happy to see them. So get creative and send in your haikus. Now, after a long time without setting foot on a ship, I recently sailed on the brand new edition of the Viking fleet, the Viking Venus, and it was great to be back on board again after so long. So here is my little effort at trying to capture in haiku form the essence of what I felt about rejoining a ship. It goes like this. Under my feet, the creaking of the gangway sounds familiar. Under my feet, the creak of the gangway sounds familiar. That's my haiku. Now send me yours with the theme, if you will, of back on board. Okay, that's all from me today. So from myself and the wonderful Viking TV team, until the next time we meet, a very good night to you all. Goodbye.